The room stank of death long before the king took his last breath. Servants gagged as they entered, the air thick, sour, and heavy, carrying the scent of a body already decomposing while it still lived. In the chair sat not a monarch, but a bloated ruin of one. His flesh sagged, his lungs wheezed, his eyes clouded with blindness. He was a king who had become a living corpse. What happens when a man born to rule England rots alive before his people? Not mourned, but mocked. This is the story of George IV, whose final years reveal one of the most grotesque deaths in royal history. And if you're drawn to the darker side of kings and empires, you've found your home here at Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe now, because what comes next will take you deep into the shadows history tried to hide. He was not always grotesque. In fact, George Augustus Frederick, born on a summer day in 1762, entered the world with every advantage a prince could dream of. He was the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, heir to power, wealth, and the admiration of a nation. To those who saw him in his youth, he seemed almost dazzling. His wit charmed courtiers, his looks caught the eye of society, and his intelligence gave the impression of a future monarch destined to shine. They called him the first gentleman of England, and for a time it seemed true, but perfection in a golden cradle often hides cracks. Behind the glittering promise lay a boy suffocated by a father's severity. George III, devout and moral to the point of obsession, ruled his household with discipline as rigid as iron bars. For the young prince, the palace felt less like home and more like a cage. Every sermon on thrift, every demand for restraint, pressed harder against a boy who longed for freedom, for pleasure, for the thrill of life unbound. When freedom finally came, it was seized with both hands. At just 21, George established his residence at Carlton House on London's Pall Mall. What should have been the home of a disciplined heir became instead a theater of excess. Chandeliers burned through the night while music, laughter, and drunken voices echoed through its halls. Gambling tables stayed warm with coin, bottles emptied by the dozen, and the prince himself reveled at the center, restless, indulgent, desperate to taste everything that had been denied to him under his father's stern watch. London's press feasted on him. Cartoonists drew him as a glutton, a drunkard, a fool, but the scandal only seemed to fuel his appetite. His mornings began with meals that could have satisfied an army: pigeons, steaks, bottles of wine, ports, and brandy, before the day had even started. Afternoons were no quieter, filled with endless luncheons and feasts that recalled the decadence of Rome. As the dishes piled high, so too did his debts. Jewelers, tailors, and moneylenders lined up outside Carlton House, desperate to recover sums that even the prince himself seemed unable to count. Parliament, humiliated and weary, paid his bills again and again, only to watch him squander more. And as the accounts drained, so did his body. By his mid-30s, George was already showing the toll of such reckless abandon. The sharpness of his face gave way to softness, the athletic frame hidden beneath swelling layers of flesh. Vanity pushed back against decay. He laced himself into tight corsets, powdered his cheeks, dressed in flamboyant costumes designed to dazzle. But no mirror could fully disguise the truth. The Golden Prince was already beginning to rot from within. It was not only gluttony and debt that shadowed him. In 1785, George defied both law and crown by secretly marrying Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow. To him, she was comfort and desire. To Britain, it was scandal of the highest order. The marriage was illegal, a direct violation of the Royal Marriages Act, and whispered fears of a constitutional crisis spread through London's drawing rooms. It was love perhaps, or perhaps just another indulgence, but it cemented his image as a man for whom rules existed only to be broken. So the young prince who had been born to admiration became instead the subject of mockery, suspicion, and shame. He had everything, and yet nothing satisfied. He was destined to sit upon a throne, yet already he was enslaved to appetite, vanity, and recklessness. His story, from the very beginning, carried the scent of decay. What do you think? Was George a victim of too much privilege, a boy broken by the suffocating hand of his father's discipline, or was he the architect of his own downfall, building his ruin with every reckless choice? Let us know in the comments below, because your voice helps keep these dark histories alive. The prince's hunger for indulgence did not end with food, wine, or jewels. It carried into his personal life, where desire, duty, and disdain collided in ways that would scandalize both court and kingdom. By the mid-1780s, his secret bond with Maria Fitzherbert was already a matter of whispered rumor. To George, she was not merely a companion but an escape, a widow who offered him affection without judgment, a kind of solace from the suffocating expectations of monarchy. Yet her Catholic faith and the illegality of their union made the relationship a dangerous secret. To admit it openly would be to risk a constitutional crisis, and so the affair simmered beneath the surface, known but unspoken, a shadow clinging to his reputation. But duty demanded another match. In 1795, George was pressured into marrying Princess Caroline of Brunswick, a woman he had never met, chosen more for politics than affection. When she arrived, the encounter was a disaster from the first breath. He recoiled at her presence, asking for brandy to steady his disgust. She, in turn, declared him fat, repulsive, and nothing like the flattering portraits she had been shown. Their wedding night ended with the groom collapsed in the fireplace, insensible from drink, an omen of the years that would follow. The marriage was less a union than a public farce. Husband and wife loathed one another, and their contempt spilled openly into the public eye. Their arguments, separations, and humiliations became fuel for London's satirical press, which painted them as grotesque caricatures rather than royals. The newspapers mocked their scandals. Cartoonists delighted in portraying their hatred as theater. In an age where the monarchy was supposed to embody dignity and moral strength, George and Caroline became a spectacle of ridicule. His cruelty toward her reached its most infamous moment when, as king, he attempted to bar her from his own coronation. The queen, excluded from the crowning of her husband, became a symbol of injustice. The public, already weary of George's excesses, rallied to her side. To them, Caroline was the wronged woman, while George was cast as a tyrant, a bloated, bitter man desperate to erase the wife he despised. When she died suddenly in 1821, many believed the stress of his persecution had hastened her end. Her funeral drew crowds of mourners, a striking contrast to the mockery George himself would face less than a decade later. What should have been a royal marriage to strengthen the crown instead eroded it, leaving the monarchy itself stained by scandal. George's private life was no longer private. His affairs, his disdain for duty, his failures as husband and father, all became part of the spectacle. And with each passing year, his image of the first gentleman of England crumbled further, replaced by the picture of a man consumed by desire, spite, and indulgence. The Golden Prince was rotting faster than even his body could show, and the nation was watching every step of his decay. When madness finally consumed King George III, the son he had so often scorned stepped into power as Prince Regent. It should have been a moment of triumph, a chance for George to prove himself not just a figure of indulgence but a ruler worthy of the crown. London glittered with anticipation, and for a time so did he. Under his patronage the arts flourished. Architects raised new visions of elegance: Regent Street, Carlton Terrace, the fantastical domes of the Brighton Pavilion. Painters and musicians thrived under his lavish support, and society basked in the glow of endless balls and celebrations. To the casual eye, England had never been so alive with style and grandeur. But behind the brilliance, rot festered. George was not simply hosting parties. He was drowning in them. The banquets grew obscene in scale, tables sagging beneath mountains of roasted meat, oceans of wine, rivers of champagne. In just 6 weeks of 1816, more than 5,000 pounds of meat were delivered to Carlton House. He gorged himself until his body gave way to stupor, collapsing into drugged sleep while his guests looked on in horrified silence. The Regent of England, meant to embody leadership and poise, had become the centerpiece of his own grotesque circus. His dependence on laudanum liquid opium deepened in these years. The drug dulled his pain but also clouded his mind, leaving him incoherent for days. Ministers found themselves managing a man half-drunk, half-drugged, and wholly unreliable. Diplomats whispered abroad that England's ruler was unfit to speak. His words slurred, his presence pitiful. The crown glittered on the outside, but inside, the monarchy was corroding. And yet, even as his body swelled and his mind faltered, George clung to vanity. Portraits painted him in robes of splendor, bedecked in jewels, a vision of majesty. But no brush could erase the truth. By the end of his regency, the first gentleman of England had become a parody of himself, brilliant in spectacle, hollow in substance, and already sliding into ruin. If you've followed the story this far, you are part of a rare circle. Those who seek the unvarnished, unsettling truths of history, the shadows behind the crowns. Show us you're here by leaving a like on this video, and join our growing family at Cursed Chronicles by subscribing. Together, we'll keep unearthing the secrets that history tried to hide. When George finally inherited the crown in 1820, the throne was no longer a symbol of majesty. It was a stage for mockery. His coronation, meant to dazzle the nation, became a grotesque spectacle. Draped in silver robes and crowned with over 12,000 rented diamonds, he was compared not to a king, but to a bloated whale masquerading in glitter. The cost of the ceremony neared £1 million, an unthinkable sum, and yet it won him no respect. To his people, it was not a celebration of monarchy but a monument to his vanity. Politically, he proved just as hollow. His obsession with divorcing Caroline had already enraged the public, and his attempts at governance were clumsy, naive, and swiftly brushed aside by Parliament. Ministers treated him less as a sovereign and more as a nuisance, an obstacle to be managed while real affairs of state carried on without him. For a king, there was no greater humiliation than irrelevance. Meanwhile, his body betrayed him more each year. His weight ballooned beyond 280 pounds. His legs swelled with fluid so painfully that stairs became impossible, and servants were forced to hoist him about like furniture. His flesh sagged in folds that sweated and oozed. His breath rattled under the crush of his own chest, and still he demanded meals rich with spice and wine. He wore corsets to force his belly into shape, but the illusion fooled no one. He ordered mirrors removed from his chambers because the reflection staring back was no longer human, only a monstrous parody of the prince he once was. The stench of his decay became legend. Visitors spoke of it in whispers. The foul air that clung to his chambers, a reek of rotting flesh and unwashed folds that no cologne could mask. His presence was detectable from rooms away. Servants gagged, maids gossiped, and footmen spoke of carrying him as if he were a carcass rather than a king. Behind closed doors, even those bound to serve him mocked the sovereign they could no longer respect. Which of these images shocks you most? The whale-like coronation dripping in jewels, the servants groaning under his swollen frame, or the stench that followed him like a curse? Tell us in the comments below, and subscribe to Cursed Chronicles so you never miss the hidden truths of history's most haunted figures. By the mid-1820s, the man who once captivated society with his wit and elegance had become a prisoner of his own body. Every indulgence of his youth now came back to punish him with a vengeance. His legs, swollen with fluid, throbbed under the pressure of gout and dropsy until even the simplest movement was agony. He could no longer climb stairs or walk unaided. Palaces built to impress kings and foreign dignitaries became cages, each hallway too long, each step a torment. Servants devised chairs, pulleys, and contraptions to haul him from one chamber to the next. The dignity of monarchy shrank into the humiliating groans of footmen carrying a man too heavy to bear his own weight. Meals, once the delight of his existence, turned into spectacles of misery. He could barely hold a fork in his swollen hands, his fingers gnarled and useless. Often he was reduced to being fed like a child, attendants spooning food into his mouth as he gasped for breath between bites. Yet even in pain, his appetite raged on. He demanded elaborate dishes heavy with spice, chewing mechanically as though the ritual of indulgence mattered more than the nourishment itself. It was not feasting anymore, it was compulsion, the ghost of a man clinging to the habits that had destroyed him. Addiction wrapped around him just as tightly as his flesh. Laudanum, the opium tincture he relied on for relief, had become both poison and lifeline. He swallowed it in staggering doses, more than enough to kill ordinary men. It dulled his pain, blurred his reality, and left him incoherent, slurring, sometimes lost for days in a fog. Alcohol accompanied the drug in rivers, wine and champagne flowing as though his veins demanded it more than blood. To those who served him, the King of England appeared less like a monarch and more like a ruinous shell, half drunk, half drugged, and entirely decaying before their eyes. His mind, once quick with wit, grew unsteady and unmoored. He turned paranoid, suspecting his own attendants of mocking him behind his back, often correctly. He accused them of lies, raged at their silence, wept when reminded of his lapses in memory. At times, he slipped into delusions, insisting he had fought at Waterloo, spinning fantasies of heroism that only deepened the tragedy. His courtiers, unable to correct him, listened in silence as their bloated, immobile king claimed victories he had never seen. Even his reflection became unbearable. Mirrors were ordered out of his chambers because he could no longer face the sight of what he had become. The man who once dressed in silks and rouge, who had spent hours grooming himself to perfection, now hid from his own image. Instead, he surrounded himself with attendants who loathed their duties, attendants who tied cloth over their mouths to endure the stench, attendants who drew lots at night to decide who must sit with him as he rambled incoherently, restless and sleepless. Isolation settled over him like a shroud. Mistresses abandoned him as his appearance grew monstrous. Friends, once eager to share in his banquets, stopped visiting altogether. Even within the palace walls, his presence became intolerable. Queen Adelaide, wife of his brother William, removed herself to escape the odor that seeped through corridors. Only paid service remained, and even that came with whispers, complaints, and open disdain. The King of England, once the glittering jewel of society, now lived despised and avoided, his very existence an ordeal for those near him. The Golden Prince was gone. What remained was a man crumbling from within, both body and mind disintegrating. He was not merely aging, he was rotting one breath at a time. His court no longer gathered in splendor but in grim obligation, and the monarchy itself seemed to sag under the grotesque weight of its sovereign. No wonder whispers began to circle beyond palace walls, whispers that England's king was already more corpse than man, a living warning of what unchecked indulgence could do to a soul. By 1829, George's decline had reached its most pitiful depths. He could no longer lie in a bed, for the sheer weight of his body pressed down on his lungs until he suffocated. Instead, he slept upright in a specially built chair, propped by pillows, his massive frame trembling with every breath. Nights brought him no rest, only terror. He raved to his doctors that if he closed his eyes too long, death would snatch him away. Servants drew lots to decide who would endure his midnight vigils, forced to sit in suffocating silence while their king muttered incoherently, drifting between prayer, paranoia, and desperate pleas for more opium. The screams of pain echoed through Windsor's corridors. Gout had twisted his limbs into grotesque shapes. His bowels failed him, and infected sores wept through folds of flesh. The smell grew unbearable, seeping into tapestries, clinging to clothes, filling the palace with the stench of decay. Cloths were wrapped around faces, windows thrown open in vain. Even his brother's wife fled the stench, unable to bear being near him. What had once been whispered became openly acknowledged. The King of England reeked like a corpse long before he died. And still his appetite did not relent. He demanded heavy meals, tearing at dishes with shaking hands, choking on the very food that deepened his torment. Watching him eat was an ordeal, a grotesque pantomime of hunger, pain, and desperation. His body could no longer process the indulgence, yet his cravings held him prisoner. In these final months, the once mocking press grew almost silent. What more could they say? The king himself had become a caricature, blind, bloated, drugged, and stinking of rot. Diplomats whispered abroad that England's monarch was unfit for rule, while ministers quietly prepared for his inevitable end. On the night of June 25, 1830, the long torment reached its climax. His breathing grew shallow, his skin ashen. At 3 in the morning, he collapsed forward with a groan, his body ruptured by a massive internal hemorrhage. Blood filled his bowels as he cried out for his physician, and then the living corpse of England finally fell silent. At 3:15 a.m., George IV was dead. Yet even death could not bring dignity. The autopsy revealed a body crushed from within, fat suffocating his organs, a ruptured vessel in his stomach, a liver scarred by years of drink. He had not simply died. He had consumed himself into the grave. What do you think? Was this the tragic end of a man enslaved by appetite, or the rightful collapse of a king who mocked his duty and his people? Share your thoughts below, and join us here at Cursed Chronicles by subscribing, because history's shadows still hold many more stories like this. News of his death spread swiftly through London, but where other monarchs were mourned with solemn grief, George IV was met with a chill unlike any the crown had felt before. No tears flowed for him. No hearts ached with loss. The Times, Britain's most respected paper, wrote with unflinching cruelty, "What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow?" It was the voice of a nation speaking plainly. Their king's passing was not a tragedy, but a relief. Even in death he caused trouble. His enormous body posed a problem for undertakers, who struggled to contain him. A coffin of Spanish mahogany, lined with lead, had to be specially constructed to support the weight. The corridors of Windsor had to be reinforced with timber to bear the burden as his remains were dragged toward their final rest. Workers gagged as they handled him, for the body had already begun to decompose before death had closed his eyes. Perfumes, powders, and spices, the very things George once adored, could not mask the foul odor. For a man obsessed with appearances, it was the final humiliation. To become not an icon of splendor, but a stench too powerful to hide. His lying in state drew crowds, but they did not come to grieve. They came to gawk. Some shuffled through out of curiosity, others to confirm with their own eyes that the hated king was truly gone. The funeral procession, far from being a moment of national mourning, turned into a hushed spectacle of mockery. Courtiers whispered jokes. Dignitaries yawned with impatience. Even his own brother William, eager to claim the crown, showed little restraint in his relief. The service itself was restless, distracted, stripped of reverence. At St. George's Chapel, no mournful wails echoed, no heartfelt lamentations rose to the heavens. There were no flowers left at his coffin by friends, no secret tributes to a beloved monarch. The burial required pulleys and special supports to lower his oversized coffin into the royal vault. Every stage a reminder that his physical excess had marked him even in death. In the days that followed, Britain looked not backward with sorrow but forward with hope. The Duke of Wellington delivered the harshest epitaph of all. George, he said, was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life. The most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality. These words, coming from the man who had defeated Napoleon, carried immense weight. They were not merely personal judgment, they were the final verdict of history. Thus the man once hailed as the first gentleman of England was lowered into the ground, not as a sovereign remembered with affection, but as a cautionary tale. His reign left no noble legacy, only monuments of vanity and a reputation of rot. He began as a golden heir, dazzling and adored. He ended as a bloated corpse, despised by his people, mocked even in the grave. This was not the death of a king. It was the burial of an embarrassment, a monarch whose memory would forever stink of excess, indulgence, and waste. And so the story of George IV closes, not with mourning, but with mockery. His life, once gilded with promise, rotted into a parable of waste and decay. He reminds us that crowns and titles cannot shield a man from the weight of his own choices, and that history remembers not only victories, but humiliations. If this descent into the darker side of royalty gripped you, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, where we breathe life into history's most unsettling shadows, and share your thoughts below, because the past is never silent, and together, we can give voice to the stories others prefer to bury.